Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my day 4, which I have vault and the summer. Okay, so the thing about they're both research, so they're going to go together. So the thing about vault time is that I went in to vault time with religion and happiness, which gave me a lot of room to experiment in what I researched, which was a really valuable way to have a lot of love for the topic. Um, if we're just talking about pure criticism of the program, I think vault time works really well. I had time to think and reflect on what I was doing. I think it's important to encourage everyone to take notes as they go along on what they're thinking, so they don't realize that they hate their topic at the end of vault time, that they kind of were thinking that before. Because I could have gone with the religious and happiness thing and hated it, but not really known what I wanted to switch to, because I had to find flow. So yeah, but I think spending 6 weeks in the library just reading stuff is very, very nice. We don't really ever get that long in school to focus on something. And the time to sift through just random, I mean, I read the randomest stuff, like why are conservatives happier than liberals? I remember reading that paper. And I took notes as I went along. My claim, got more and more specific. I found flow that became an integral part of my thesis. And towards the end of reading 150 million and a half science papers, I decided that it was something I could do for myself. So unfettered vault time for me was super important considering I didn't know what I was going to do. I definitely got in the flow while I was vaulting, uh, and had no trouble reading. I mean, I love my project. Like, no matter what I was reading about, if I was reading about money or choices or religion, I was just in love with positive psychology and married to it. Like me, my and and that can get you through a lot of tough alpha coefficients when I hadn't taken stat, I didn't know what any of it meant. And then moving into the summer, so basically I decided that I wanted to do a study. And I went for it. It was very, very difficult. I mean, it was um okay, so one thing that I think was okay, one thing on the part of the I think okay. So the first thing about planning primary research over the summer is that was all of my own initiative, and that was my own googling how to set up studies, and my doing the consent forms and designing the study and buying the scales and researching the scales and making sure I had the best, most scientifically validated scales and putting all that in a science paper, which ended up being important in the appendix of my thesis. And that all comes down to how much people love their topic, and that's not really a Sutcliffe and Ingham thing, but something that I definitely grew in the primary research process was the ridiculous bureaucratic hoops that we had to jump over. The fact that no one was really sure what hoops we had to jump over, and I just jumped over a lot of needless things that would have I could have saved time over the summer and actually written better papers coming into senior year than I did, because I wasted time doing Dr. Reuter and Dr. Reuter Dr. Reuter stuff, which she has to do, but that wasn't necessarily well structured or well organized. But we were the first one, so you know what happens. But that would be my only complaint. Let's see, planning primary research. I wrote 2 terrible papers. I don't know if there's anything that I mean, I think the program did a great job. I mean, giving you, I think that's where it comes down to self motivation. But the check-ins over the summer were good. Um, I think that anytime that Miss Sutcliffe opens dialogue with somebody, she makes their lives better. So Miss Sutcliffe should just talk to people as much as she possibly can. Um, yeah, basically, I tried to be a scientist. I did my best. It worked out pretty okay, and the love of my topic kept me going through and I would spend 3 hours a day. Probably, I spent probably an hour a day on average. So if we just pretend I worked every day, I probably spent about an hour a day every day doing thesis stuff, maybe a little bit more. It was a hard summer between thesis and ACT and all that jazz, but it worked out. So I came to school with 2 crappy but complete papers and a plan for my primary research. So good stuff. Self motivation is important.